So where do these pictures come from? Well, they come from NASA, the organization founded by Christians to further God's kingdom, right? No, obviously not. NASA was started by Nazis, Freemasons, and magicians. If you guys look up Operation Paperclip, L. Ron Hubbard, Jack Parsons, all the early astronauts, the fact that they supposedly put a Masonic lodge on the moon, all crazy stuff, okay? Now, one of the things that these government agencies love to do is they love to create acronyms like NASA, but they also like to make it sound like a word that may be similar to what they're doing. So the interesting part about NASA is there is a Hebrew word very close to the word NASA, and it's Nasa or Nashah, depending on how you pronounce it. And the crazy thing is that this word has two very appropriate double meanings. Okay, it can mean to lift up. So when God gave Cain a mark, he said, "This is more than I can bear." That word bear means to lift up. And the other meaning is when beguile. So when the serpent beguiled Eve in the garden. Okay, so Nashah in Hebrew has a double meaning. It can mean to lift up like a rocket to space, or it can mean to deceive like the serpent deceived Eve in the garden. Another thing about this logo, the Hebrew word for tongue, lashon, means fork of flame. And as you can see, there is a nice big serpent tongue going right through the NASA logo. Another one of my favorite things is the fact that, David, we were just talking about, who was I just talking to this about? I can't remember. Anyways, so God spoke in these things into existence during Genesis, right? Every day starts with, and then God said, "Let there be light," the firmament, plants, animals, etc. Sun, moon, and stars. So to me, it's like God created our world by speaking, and now this logo is saying now Satan is creating one to cover that up, a counterfeit. Amen. That's just what I read into this logo here. Okay, so I showed you the pretty picture of the Milky Way galaxy. That is not a picture, it's actually an artist concept, okay? And a lot of people don't realize it, but NASA employs artists. They just don't call them artists, they call them data visualizers. So this is a video on how these guys take data, they take graphs, they take fuzzy photos, and they turn them into things that look like Star Trek and Star Wars. So I'm gonna hit play here.
Was something NASA latched onto early on. For over 50 years, NASA worked closely with artists and creative leaders like Walt Disney and Norman Rockwell to help shape the stories of spaceflight. It's the same legacy today, just with more advanced scientific understanding and better tools to imagine what far-off worlds might look like if we could visit them.
We want to take a lot of care to make sure we don't oversell the part of the story that isn't actually the story. There are people who just look and think, oh, NASA's photographed a planet, and they don't understand that actually that was a piece of art. On the other hand, if we don't do that, and we don't put a piece of compelling artwork, then people may never even look at the story anyway. We're putting as much science as we can of what we know today, and I like to think that in 50 years when people come back and look at, say, the various pictures of exoplanets after maybe we actually know what they look like, they might wink and smile to each other like, oh, that's so funny, they thought there was water on that one. But also appreciate that this is kind of a historical record of how our understanding of these planets has changed over time.
Interesting. So remember we talked about the bones that we found, and then we had an artist draw their representation of what those bones represent. Well, at this point, we'll talk about the difference between a photo and an image, okay? A photo is a capture of reality. You're not creating anything, you're simply freezing what is in front of that camera. An image is a representation of reality. An image is something that is doctored, something that is created from scratch. Okay, that's where we get CGI, computer-generated images. And what you'll find when you look around at nasa.gov, and we'll go through some stuff, is they almost never say photo. Almost never. So right here, this is a photo of Pluto, one of the original ones, okay? And then this is one of the original images of Pluto, right? So this is what the data visualizers get, and that's what they create. Now, when we watched the video, it said that NASA had some associations with Norman Rockwell, the artist, and who was the other one? Walt Disney. Man, you guys are listening. And isn't it awesome that the planet Pluto has Pluto the dog like right there? Isn't that cool? Thank you, Walt Disney. Right, Walt Disney, the logo that has 3 6s in it right there, right? Pretty crazy. I'm sure it's just a coincidence, right? I'm sure it's just a coincidence that Mickey, when reflected upside down, also says wicked, right? It's just coincidence, right? Yeah, so 666, which is interesting because the Earth is supposedly on a 23.4 degree tilt, and when you take that, the resultant angle out of 90 degrees, that's 66.6 degrees. All right, look at that. Is that where we live? Okay. So this is something called the blue marble. All right, this was created in 2002, and I say created because it's not a photo, it's an image. All right, we already talked about the difference between photo and image. In 2 Thessalonians, it talks about a strong delusion. Okay, it talks about a strong delusion for those that do not have a love for the truth. And the word for delusion is plane, okay, which is the root word for planet. And I'm not sure if there's a correlate. There might be another coincidence there. I'm not sure. So the blue marble, let's see. This is a spectacular blue marble image, is the most detailed true color image of the entire Earth to date. See, they say image over and over. Using a collection of satellite-based observations, scientists and visualizers stitched together months of observations of the land surface, oceans, sea ice, and clouds into a seamless, true color mosaic of every square kilometer of our planet. So this is as they say, a mosaic. What they've done is they've taken low-altitude photographs of the Earth, and they've stitched it together, and we'll show you a little bit more how they do it here. This guy's name's Robert Simon. He's known as like the father of the blue marble, okay? And you can see, by the way, so right there, it's nasa.gov, where I'm getting this information from. Robert Simon, again, nasa.gov. Oh, wait, check this out. This is cool. I got a laser pointer on here. nasa.gov. Okay, this is the same article. Okay, he's talking about his role at NASA as a data visualizer. He says, my role is to make imagery from Earth science's data. I turn data into pictures. And now this is talking about what he did to create the blue marble. If you look in the highlighted area, it says, then we wrapped the flat map around a ball. My part was integrating the surface cloud, integrating means creating, by the way, integrating the surface, clouds, and oceans to match people's expectations of how Earth looks from space. So no one's ever seen Earth from space, but we're still going to match their expectations of what it looks like from space. Here's another, there's a photo of Earth. Oh wait, no, this is a detailed photo-like view of Earth. Again, nasa.gov. What about all the pictures? Yeah, exactly. What about all the pictures? So the reason why the 2002 blue marble was a big deal was because they say that the last time a photo was taken of an entire hemisphere of Earth was in 1972 on our way to the moon, okay? And in my opinion, all you have to do is look at the moon footage just to see that it's not real. There's a lot to go in here, but it just doesn't even look real to me. Our stuff's gotten so much better, I guess. I don't know if y'all could hear that. He said, my problem with this photo is that it's taken from the moon, taking video of the first ever landing on the moon. And also, who filmed Who filmed this one, as it's leaving? And pans up. I also like that Richard Nixon was able to get on a landline and call the moon as well. All right, so here's a video of, this is actually Rob Skiba, who downloaded this photo from nasa.gov and then scrolled up to the the Earth in the background and changed the exposure to show that there's a square box around the Earth where somebody copy and pasted it in right there. That's downloaded straight off NASA's website. Same here. This is supposed to be the Earth rising. Once again, you see the box around the Earth in all these photos. This is Don Pettit, supposedly an astronaut, is asked about going back to the moon. It's kind of hard to hear this first part, but he says, "I'd go back to the moon in a nanosecond."
I'd go to the moon in a nanosecond. The problem is we don't have the technology to do that anymore. We used to, but we destroyed that technology, and it's a painful process to build it back again.
Tough quote there. Yeah. Here's another great shot of Neil deGrasse Tyson again talking about the Red Bull space jump. Have you guys seen that? Felix Baumgartner jumped out of a balloon, parachuted down.
So if the Earth were actually this size, the International Space Station would be orbiting at about a half an inch above the surface. And the dude who jumped out of a perfectly good balloon, what's his name? Felix Baumgartner. He would have been about 2 millimeters above the surface of this globe. That's his edge of space jump. Now, and he wants to, I don't have a problem if he does it, but the honesty of it would greatly diminish what I think people thought he was actually doing. And not only that, they made sure to photograph him standing there with a really wide-angle lens, which curves horizontal lines. So in the photo, you see this curvature of Earth's surface, and you go, wow, he's in space, look at that. No, he's not. At that height, you don't see the curvature of the Earth if you are 2 millimeters above this pitfall. You just don't. That stuff is flat.
Interesting, it is flat. Yeah, so here's a shot. Okay, this guy took a balloon up, 127,000 feet. All right, and you can see this is planet New Mexico right here because there's no water on it, right? So they have a very wide-angle lens, making it look like he's higher than he actually is. Because when you look inside the capsule and the door opens up, look at that horizon right there. Looks pretty flat. Again, planet New Mexico, and the flat horizon inside the capsule when you're using a camera that does not have a fisheye lens on it. This is a gentleman who did some digging around on Google Earth looking in Canada and found the site where NASA practices for the moon missions. And you can see it looks very similar to Mars. Excuse me, I said moon missions. This is Mars. Let me start this over. Yeah, Mars. Okay, and not only does it look kind of like Mars, you'll see that it actually looks exactly like Mars here in a second. So one of these pictures is from Canada. One of these pictures is from Mars. Exact same rocks. He's going to look around a little bit more. One of these pictures is from Canada, and one is from Mars. Just a red filter there. He's looking around a little bit more, and he's going to actually find something really cool. Oh, look at that. There's the rover. It's got a NASA logo on it right there. Finds these trucks. It says there's NASA. It says Project Mars. Mars Project right there. This is really cool. These are contact lenses where you can view augmented reality. So you're able to You're able to see things that they can then project as if it's happening in real time. So here's a really hilarious, see this guy, he thinks he's grabbing something and putting it away. He thinks he's grabbing this guy's hat, but there's nothing there. And you can see his dark eyes, right? All right, so here, this microphone is actually in his hand. This microphone is actually not really there. So he's holding it with his left hand, and then he slides his right hand under his left hand, which there shouldn't be any room there because the microphone's there. So that microphone is actually augmented reality. It's not actually there. This guy's head disappears right here. This guy fully disappears as he's going away. Watch this. These guys appear out of nowhere. I'm not sure what this is showing, but some kind of shenanigans, I'm sure. These guys just dissolve. So right here, that's a green screen in the background. And here we start looking at some harnesses. So they love to do the hairspray thing with the girls to show their hair standing up. But when they're on like live streams with classrooms, they love to do the backflip right here. But you'll see this guy reach up, the guy in the back reaches up to grab the harness, and then the guy at the bottom grabs the harness again. Oh, there we go. Grabbed it again. Yep. Thank you. Whoops. Okay. Another harness deal. Look at this guy's shirt. Okay. Whoops. Just like Mission Impossible. This one's hilarious. Look at the dude's head in the background. This is a miniature. They're trying to show like NASA. This is a live feed. NASA launching a satellite here from the shuttle, and this guy accidentally gets in the background here, and then he realizes it. Look, he looks and goes, oh, let me move. Yep, let me get out of here, and he goes out of there real quick. This is a buddy of mine. His name's Justin Harvey. He's at the Brevard County Commission, where NASA is in Florida. And he is basically asking the county commissioner to investigate NASA and the fact that NASA gets $65 million a day to spend on whatever they want to spend it on. And what he's found is that there's 3 people that were in the Challenger explosion that he thinks are still alive because they have the same face, the same name, and the same birthday.
I think we all remember the Challenger explosion that took place in 1986 that tragically took the lives of all 7 astronauts on board. It launched not too far from where we're standing here today. Well, the interesting thing is, a couple decades later, this thing called the internet came about, and someone allegedly found almost all of those astronauts alive and well, many using the same exact names. As you can see here, we have Challenger astronaut Judith Resnick, and also the Judith Resnick Yale Law professor. Michael J. Smith, the pilot of the Challenger astronaut, and also professor at University of Wisconsin, now retired, Michael J. Smith. Commander Dick Scobie, who is now president of Cows and Trees. Now, you'll notice they all have the exact same faces 30 some odd years later, the same exact name, and they're the same age.
And he concentrated on those 3 because they were the most obvious, but there's also people that think, or that have found identical twins that didn't attend their twins' funeral and things like that. Very strange stuff. So that NASA is the entity mostly responsible for the things that we see on screens and in textbooks. And if we establish that their roots are not Christian roots, but rather satanic roots, and we catch them over and over and over doing untruthful things, I think it's time that we go looking for an alternative. And like I said earlier, I don't believe in this silly meme right here, the square pancake floating through the solar system that you could just sail off of into the nothingness of space. But what I do believe in is something a little bit more like this. If you were to take the globe, punch a hole in it in Antarctica, and then flatten it, this is what I believe the shape of our world actually looks like right here. So we've got the North Pole directly in the center. Let me get this laser pointer going again. So North Pole right there. There is no South Pole. Antarctica is no longer a continent at the bottom of the globe, but rather a continental ice shelf. that surrounds and bounds the waters. And then that is where I believe the firmament or the dome created on day 2 rests. I believe it comes down in Antarctica or beyond. There's some arguments there. And I believe the sun, moon, and stars are smaller, closer, and do circles inside our Earth system. Not a solar system, but an Earth system. I believe of the 200 plus verses in the Bible that describe the cosmology of the Hebrews, I believe that this is the one that fulfills all of them. It's an alternative design, yes, but it is an alternative design that does not require us to abandon our senses and to embrace non-Christian ideals like denying page 1 of the Bible. Let me get this off of here. So we could go through all the verses, and we will go through a lot of them, but a good return for 2 minutes of your time would be to just Google Hebrew cosmology. And this is what we're looking at right here. That's a little bit more clear. So you can see a flat earth with a firmament or dome above it with water above that. If you guys can picture like when you were little in the bathtub and you take a bowl upside down and push it down in the water and capture like a little air pocket, that's what I believe we live in. It is interesting that, again, I'm going to bring up Disney right here. The Disney logo, I believe, has a dome or firmament in it. Another crazy thing is that it also has a tower whose top would reach into heaven, just like the Tower of Babel, Genesis 11, right? It's also interesting that Walt Disney is an honorary member of Operation Deep Freeze. Operation Deep Freeze was a military mission where they went deep into the Antarctic, and I believe either got to or witnessed where the firmament comes down and meets, where heaven meets earth. And the reason he's an honorary member is because Disney Studios filmed Operation Deep Freeze. You can still find that footage on the internet. And then immediately after they find the firmament, they have what's called Operation Fishbowl, where they start exploding high-altitude nuclear weapons, in my opinion, to test the height of the firmament. And they called this Operation Fishbowl, which is a little bit fishy because, as you can see, the biblical description of our world is basically a glass surrounded in water. So it's like we're in a fishbowl, okay? I don't know why else they would call it Operation Fishbowl. So, what does the Bible say about the shape of our earth? So I'm actually gonna open my book here. I mentioned a little bit earlier. It's called The House That Jesus Built. If you guys go to mattlongbook.com, that just takes you straight to the Amazon link. So there's a number of things I want to talk about, but first I wanted to establish that most ancient cultures across the world believed something similar to what's on the left there. And they were all able to navigate by the stars, and they were all able to tell time with their star-based calendars. It wasn't until someone told them they were on a spinning ball flying through space, which is when they started exploring those ideas, because you wouldn't think that by your experience. We experience a flat, non-rotating earth like I talked about earlier. So to get into the actual scriptures here, I wanted to address the only two, in my opinion, that have any ambiguity as far as flat earth and globe go. So there's Isaiah 40:22, which says, "It is he who sits upon the circle of the earth, and the inhabitants are as grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them out as a tent to dwell in." Okay? Now, Isaiah says that the earth is a circle, and a lot of people would say, see, the Bible says the earth's a ball. Well, circle and ball are actually a little bit different. Isaiah, in Isaiah 22:18, uses the Hebrew word for ball when he's describing something being tossed like a ball. But when he talks about the earth, he uses the Hebrew word for circle. And a circle is round, and it is also flat, just like a pizza. A pizza is round and flat. This is hard holding the mic and doing this. So the other one would be Job 26:7, and I've got it right here. I think I turned too many pages. Job 26:7 says that God stretches out the north over the empty space. He hangs the earth upon nothing. So we established earlier that the North Pole is the center. which means the north would be the tallest part of the dome. And if he stretches out the north over the empty space, that makes sense. He also says the earth hangs upon nothing. And so people may say, see, it says the earth is floating in space. It's hanging on nothing. But I think that actually means that the earth isn't hanging on anything. It's actually set on pillars and foundations, just like it says later in Job. I don't think Job would contradict himself. In fact, that's God speaking later, talking about the foundations of the earth. And I don't think God would contradict himself either. So, science tells us that the earth is spinning 1,000 miles an hour at the equator, that it's traveling around the sun at 66,000 miles an hour, that the sun is traveling through the galaxy at 450,000 miles an hour, and that the universe is expanding at over 1 million miles an hour. Yet the Bible says that the earth is fixed and motionless. In 1 Chronicles 16:30, it says, "The world also shall be stable, that it not be moved." Psalm 93:1 says, "The world is also established, that it not be moved." Psalm 96:10, "The world also shall be established, that it shall not be moved." Psalm 104:5, "You laid the earth on its foundations, so that it should never be moved." So that's obviously like a direct contradiction. So that's what I brought up at the beginning. Are we going to embrace the Bible and reject science, or are we going to embrace science and reject the Bible? Some other biblical conflicts. The fact that the earth existed for 3 days before the sun was created. Okay, in the scientific model, it says that the earth revolves around the sun. So what would the earth have been revolving around before the sun was created? It says that daylight predates sunlight, which is pretty crazy. We had evening and morning 3 times before the sun was even created. How does that work? I don't think it can work in a globe model, but if you guys ask some Q&A, we could talk about that. So the Bible says that Satan shows Jesus all the kingdoms of the world in Matthew 4:8. It says that the whole world will see Jesus when he returns in the clouds. In Revelation 1:7, I don't think that's physically possible on a globe. We see that in Joshua praying to God to stop the sun so that he can continue to chase down the Amalekites, because he felt like if it got dark, he wouldn't be able to finish conquering them. And that's Joshua 10:12. The interesting thing is that God stops the sun and the moon over specific locations. And, people could say, well, God just stopped the earth from spinning. Okay, except the earth is spinning 1,000 miles an hour at the equator, so if anything that wasn't nailed down and some stuff that would be nailed down would just keep going and literally die. I think it was Neil deGrasse Tyson that said, if that scripture is true, then everything on earth would be killed. The interesting thing is, the reason we think the sun moves is because the earth is supposedly spinning. So if the earth stopped spinning, the moon would actually keep going, because the moon's not tied to the sun-earth relationship. So it's interesting that it says that God stopped the sun and the moon over specific places. All right, so I'm going to try to cruise through some verses here that help describe this. So the ancients believed that the earth was both round and flat, like a pizza. The center of the pizza is the North Pole, and the crust are the ice walls and the mountain ranges of Antarctica. Where the land turns up, so in Job 38:14, describes how the land turns up and bounds the waters, and Job 26:8. Antarctica, like I said, is not a continent at the bottom of the globe, but rather a continental ice shelf. And the fact that Antarctica is actually the highest continent by elevation by far means that it would serve this role perfectly. The 4 corners of the earth, I believe, actually occur at the center of the earth, okay? Possible explanation is that where the pizza slices come together in the very center, that's where the 4 corners of the earth are. So when John is in heaven and he looks down and he sees in Revelation 7:1, all 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, he sees them all at the same time, all right? And I believe that's because he's seeing them in the same place at the center of the earth, because the Bible in Genesis, talking about the Garden of Eden, says that there were 4 rivers emanating out of one. And when you create 4 rivers out of one, that creates 4 corners. And so I believe also that the Garden of Eden was at the center of the earth and that the Tigris and the Euphrates are just named after those rivers, which is why you can't find the other two in the Middle East. We name things after things all the time. I also believe that directly above that is where the throne of God is. Okay, the northern lights are the emerald rainbow around the throne. John sees an emerald rainbow around the throne of God in Revelation 4:3. And we establish in Isaiah 14:13 that God sits above the north. Okay? God sits above the north on his sea of glass, as it says in Revelation 4:6. Okay, the sea of glass is the strong firmament or molten looking glass, as it's described in Job 37:18. This transparent dome spans above the entire earth that God formed by pressing down on it like clay under the seal, as described in Job 38:14. This is similar to the way a king would seal an ancient document by heating the clay, pressing down on it, and the sides would rise up, just like pizza crust, right? So, I mentioned the northern lights. I believe, John sees an emerald rainbow. Emeralds are green, so I believe the northern lights are the emerald rainbow that are emanating from the throne of God. And this is speculation here, but we mentioned in Psalm 48:2 and Isaiah 14:13 that God resides in the sides of the north. These verses not only refer to God being in the north, but it also talks about a great mountain upon which God dwells. So many ancient maps depict a dark mountain at the center of the flat earth, and this would be a dark mountain in the midst of four rivers. So we can see our Mercator's map from 1620. There's a large mountain called the Rupus Negra et Altissima, which means the black and very high rock at the center of our world. And sometimes you might see it called Mount Meru, you might see it called Mount Zion, but this would be an enormous black mountain, likely multiple times taller than Mount Everest. And I believe this is probably the place where the devil took Jesus in Matthew 4 to show him all the kingdoms of the world. So if this mountain, by chance, is made of magnetite, which is the darkest and most magnetic of rocks found on Earth, this mountain would give the North Pole its magnetic properties, which I believe is biblical because a compass always points north. Okay? There is never a point where you cross the equator and then the southern part of the non-red part of your compass starts to point south. It never happens. What happens is the further away from the North Pole you get, the less accurate your compass is. Which, if we lived on a globe, what should happen is your compass should get less accurate as you approach the equator and then more accurate as you approach the South Pole, but that's not what happens. In fact, the compass is known as the least, lost the word. It's known as the most ineffective tool in Antarctica. And something I also talk about in my book is the fact that I think the Christmas tree might be a symbol of this rock at the center of our world. So if this is a black metallic rock, which is what magnetite would be, it would reflect at night the green emerald lights around the throne, and it would also reflect the stars around Polaris. And then Polaris would actually be at the top, which is the star that all the other stars rotate around. So the Christmas tree it would look green, okay, with lights on it, with a star at the top. And so I believe that's what the Christmas tree represents. Not a pagan symbol as some people would like to make it out to be, but rather a depiction of God's dwelling place in relation to his true creation. The New Jerusalem, right? We see in Revelation 6:4 the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven. And John gives us the dimensions of it. It's like 1,400 feet long by 1,400 feet wide by 1,400 feet tall. That could be a cube. It could be a pyramid. But the problem with that is, if it's 1,400 feet long, the 12 foundations that it's built on would have to have a hump in the middle the size of 22 Mount Everest in order to conform to the shape of a globe. And I don't believe that's the case. Noah's flood. So mainstream Christian science would say that the firmament was an ice blanket around the globe that was holding waters up, and during the flood it perished and all the waters came down and flooded the earth. The problem is, in Psalm 48, David talks about the waters above the sky as if they're still there. He also says that they've been established forever. So those waters are still up there. And I don't believe there would be enough water on a globe to flood the earth to a height of 15 feet above the highest mountain, especially if Mount Everest is possibly not the highest mountain, but maybe the dark mountain at the center of our world. What's interesting is if you take that, the example I used earlier about the earth and the bathtub, if you go into a bathtub and you take a bowl and you turn it upside down and you push the bowl underwater, it creates an air pocket underneath. So like a pressurized system, which is what we live in. We live in a pressurized system. And if you open the windows of heaven, like it says in Genesis, so Genesis says that God opened the windows of heaven right before the flood, right? Well, some people would say, oh, well, that's the waters are going to come down. Well, yes, but also what's happening there is he's letting pressure out of the system. And so if you had this bowl underwater and you let pressure out, air bubbles come up and the water beneath starts to rise. And so that's why I believe the fountains of the deep burst forth in the flood, because God let pressure out so the water starts to rise. And to back that up, in order to make the waters go back down, God would have to put pressure back into the system, and I believe he did, because in Genesis 8 it talks about a wind that goes across the whole earth. And so I believe that's God pushing air back in, making the waters recede, and then it talks about him closing the fountains of the deep and closing the windows of heaven. So let's talk about Jesus. Jesus in Matthew 24 talks about how in the last days the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give her light, is what he says. So he describes the moon as if something that's not reflecting the light of the sun, but rather giving off its own light, which is interesting because people have taken thermometers and tested moonlight, and moonlight is provably cold, unlike the sun. So you go out during the day and you're in the shade. You go out in the sun, it gets hotter. You go in the shade, it gets colder. If you're in moonlight, though, if you're in the shade, you're warmer. You get out of the shade, you're colder. They've taken thermometers and actually shot the temperature of the ground, and it does the exact opposite of what the sun does during the day. So I believe that's proof that the moon is not reflecting the warm light of the sun, but rather giving off its own cool light. And Jesus knew this, so this is why he said the moon gives her light. And again, in Luke 12:56, Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, and he says, you hypocrites, you understand the face of the sky and the face of the earth, but you don't understand the time in which you live, or the age in which you live. And so what I believe Jesus is saying is, you understand the way this place works, but you don't understand the urgency of the time that you live in. And I believe that would have been a really good chance for Jesus to correct the Pharisees by saying, like, you don't even understand the workings of this place. But what he did was he confirmed the fact that they did understand the way the place worked, and this was their cosmology right here. And Jesus has a little bit of credibility because in John 1:3 it says that all things were made by him. Amen. He would know. In in Hebrews it says, his son, who he hath appointed heir of all things, also by whom he made the worlds. All right, and that word worlds actually means ages, okay? And then in Colossians it says, for by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible. All things were created by him. So that was like a quick overview. Like I could have touched on 3 times as many verses, but I believe those communicate effectively this scenario right here. So what about the science? All right, to prove the biblical account. So it was Einstein that said, no amount of experimentation can prove me right, but one experiment can prove me wrong. So what are the characteristics of a spinning ball? Well, it's curvature and motion. And here is the Chicago skyline. I just came from there. on Lake Michigan. This is 55 miles across, and you should not be able to see a single building across that lake because of these calculations here. If you were to take an Earth with a circumference of 24,900 miles and do the math, it comes out to 8 inches per mile squared. So every mile you go, you square that number of miles, multiply it times 8, and that's how many inches of vertical curvature should exist. And it's exponential because you got that square in there, so you can see that 1 mile is 8 inches, 2 mile is 32 inches, and so on all the way down to 30 right there, 7,200 inches, etc. So we'll go back to our example here. Chicago skyline, you should not be able to see any buildings, yet we can clearly see them right there. This is a world record photograph, 275 miles. This is a guy he's standing on a mountain in Spain, taking a picture of a mountain in France, all right? And it's naming the different peaks here, but this is the one right here, 275 miles away. If you were standing on flat ground, 275 times 275 times 8 divided by 12 gives you feet, divided by 5,280, that's 10 miles of missing curvature right there. Now, the higher you go up, the farther you can see. So when you adjust for the heights, there's 5 miles of missing curvature right here. All those mountains should be hidden. Mount Everest, the tallest mountain that we know of, 29,000 feet, so 29,029, that's like 5 miles. Okay, that is not Mount Everest, and you can see it. You shouldn't be able to see it. So what we found is there is no way to prove curvature down here on Earth where us poor little paupers are allowed to go. This is a couple of guys called Michelson and Morley. This is an experiment they did. It had to do with Earth's motion. This was done in like the late 1800s. It's been repeated as late as like 2009. These guys were taking light rays and bouncing them on right angles, and were theorizing that if Earth is spinning and you send these lights in different directions, that they should come back to the origin point at different times, but they weren't. And so it was actually proving that Earth was not spinning. In fact, Einstein said he came to believe, because of this experiment, that there is no way to prove Earth's motion through optics. So, why do people still believe that they live on a spinning ball flying through space if we can prove no curvature, if we can prove no motion, and if we can prove that NASA is doing a ton of fakery? Well, it's some things like sunrise, sunset, circumnavigation, not falling off an edge, ships going over the curve, okay? So we can go, let's talk about circumnavigation, because circumnavigation is simply starting in the east, going west, and coming back to the same point. Okay, that's circumnavigation right there. If you wanted to prove that the Earth was a globe, then someone should sail south and come back around from the north, but they've never done that. Anytime someone has said they're going to circumnavigate north to south, they always come to a point about here, and then they basically do a circle like this. They've never gone here and like Pac-Man'd out over there. So that's circumnavigation. Sunrise and sunset. We believe the sun and the moon are staying at constant heights, yet somehow they're setting, right? We're told the sun sets because the Earth is spinning and we're falling backwards, right? But here's an example where a guy has taken a sun on a flat table and he's pulling it back. The sun is not changing height, but what he's done is he's put a little bit of plexi paper to represent the atmosphere that we look through that creates something called atmospheric lensing. So he's going to pull this straight back. The sun is not changing height, yet it sets from the view right there. Ships going over the edge. So we're sitting on a beach, the boat's going away from us, disappears from bottom up, and then lo and behold, we get a bigger lens and we pull all the boats back into view. This is like 9 miles away. Shouldn't be able to see them, actually. It should be 50 feet of curvature, as it says. What happens is our eyes have a limited amount of angular resolution because of their size. And when you add a larger lens, you can then see things that are farther, or if you go higher. All right, so the original question. If we find areas where the Bible and science diverge, where they go in opposite directions, should we embrace science and reject the Bible, or should we embrace the Bible and reject science? Should we embrace the Bible and assume that there's an evil agenda at play, right? If the Bible says in Romans 1 that we can get to know God through the creation, and we know that the devil has already corrupted biology, geology, and all these things, should we not assume that he's going to make an attempt with cosmology as well? I believe that we should. So, in my opinion, these two scenarios here, those are the only two that can fulfill all of the verses in the Bible that literally describe our world. I think you can make a case for it all being allegory, but I do feel that if God was going to use allegory, he would use it in a way that would actually somewhat fit what we actually live in right there. So